And hello everybody again. Here is our second The Modern President, Part 2. We're obviously picking it up from where we left off, so we're going to start right into antebellum. I'm going to try and get us right through the Gilded Age, and hopefully I'll get through this a little quicker than the last one. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so we start off after the Mexican-American War. James K. Polk decides not to run for office again. Remember that. James K. Polk decides to not run for office again. This allows for the Whigs to nominate their own general. Again, it's the second general they'll nominate, Zachary Taylor, one of the heroes of the Mexican War, old Rough and Ready as he was known as. I guess the ladies like that title. I'm not really sure. Maybe he didn't shave a lot. I don't know. He wins this election quite easily. He should have had an easy election. Unfortunately for him, 1849, gold is discovered in California. There's gold in them there hills. And everyone begins to rush to California. And what kind of people go to California? Oh, just your basic good Americans, your thieves, your cutthroats, your murderers, your rapists, your extortioners, typical Americans. They go running off to California. California realizes this is going to be a problem. So they immediately petition the government to enter in as a full state so you can get federal protection. This causes massive controversy in the South. No, we will not allow California to come in as a state. Unless we divide California, make a slave state out of it. California does not want to be divided. They want to come in as a free state. All of a sudden, everyone's grabbing their guns. Everyone's pointing at each other. This is an outrage. This is an outrage. And it looks like the Civil War might actually start to begin. Enter Henry Clay in his last great compromise. The Compromise of 1850. Remember, this is an omnibus, an all or nothing. There's 8 parts to it. A quid pro quo, this for that. California comes in free, but the New Mexico and Utah territories get to decide popular sovereignty. There's a border dispute between Texas and New Mexico. Border dispute is in favor of New Mexico. Texas gets $10 million. The slave trade in Washington, D.C. They will no longer buy or sell slaves in Washington, D.C. That will become outlawed. However, you can still own slaves in Washington, D.C. And then they'll add a stricter fugitive slave law, and they'll also decide that Congress can no longer be part of the slave trade. Well, unfortunately for Clay, there's one part of the law that at least somebody disliked. Enter Stephen Douglas, who saves it and decides instead of an omnibus, we'll make it one at a time. Vote your conscience. Now, Zachary Taylor didn't like this compromise. He was going to veto it. So Zachary Taylor did the best thing he could possibly do. He dies. Sorry. That's probably kind of sad. But unfortunately, he does. July 4th, 1850, he's out celebrating in a hot day, drinking cold milk, eating frozen strawberries, perhaps gets a bad case of gastroenteritis, and a few days later, he dies. Moment of silence. All right, well, Millard Fillmore, Vice President of the United States, heard all the debates on the compromise, liked the compromise, so he passed it. So, guess what? No war! Yay, no war. At least for another 10 years. Oh, that's kind of sad. All right, so 1852 election rolls around. The Democrats get their act together and they decide, you know what, let's nominate a northerner who's pro-South. That will fix everything. Great campaign they have. We poke them in 44, we will pierce them in 52. A reference to James K. Polk and his election. So Franklin Pierce, a northerner, gets nominated President of the United States. Unfortunately for Pierce, doesn't have much of a backbone, not a very strong character of will. Stephen Douglas, the guy we mentioned earlier with the compromise, he comes back. At one point, he's a Democrat. He would like to be President of the United States. He comes up with a great plan. Kansas-Nebraska Act. What are we going to do? Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take this Nebraska territory. We're going to divide it into 2 sections. Nebraska in the north, Kansas in the south. We're going to allow popular sovereignty. That means people get to decide for themselves. Remember this, popular sovereignty. People get to decide for themselves. We'll allow people to vote in those territories if they want to go free, if they want to go slave. He felt naturally Nebraska, it'll go free. Kansas will naturally go slave. Unfortunately for him, he didn't realize the resolve of a lot of Northerners who began to pour into Kansas, and this led to bleeding Kansas. A civil war breaks out in Kansas. Dozens and eventually hundreds of individuals begin to slaughter each other over the issue of slavery. Under Pierce's presidency, he was an expansionist. He opened up trade with Japan. For instance, there was the Onstead Manifesto that took place. They tried to acquire Cuba at one point. So there's a lot of things going on. But when the election of 56 rolls around, the Democrats realize they cannot keep Pierce. There's too much blood on his hands. And they don't want to nominate Stephen Douglas either. So they go with someone they call Kansas Less, James Buchanan. Our only, wait for it, our only bachelor president. Yes, never was married, James Buchanan. Well, James Buchanan, interesting guy. Basically, he starts a civil war. Crazy thing, There's a situation called the Dred Scott case. It's a Supreme Court case. Dred Scott was a slave whose owner moved to free Illinois. Then he moved to free territory in Wisconsin, and then he dies. Dred Scott feels, hey, I've been living on free soil for all these years. I'm a free man. State of Mississippi, actually, no, take that back, Missouri. They decide, no, you're not free. You're going to be sold back into slavery. Dred Scott says, I'll take this to court. Dred Scott versus Sanford goes to the Supreme Court. Guess what? The Supreme Court, a guy named Roger Taney says, no, you know what? You're not a citizen of the United States, so thereby you have no standing in court. Plus, guess what? The way I look at the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment says the protection of property. You know what slaves are? Property. This has always been the Constitution. Thereby, I say the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Slavery can be anywhere in the United States. Wow. What a blow to Northern abolitionist movement. James Buchanan, President of the United States, he convinces a Northern judge from Pennsylvania to side with the Southerners, basically committing, treason here. The Lecompton Constitution. Kansas tries to get its act together, and they come up with a constitution. You can vote for us for slavery or against slavery. But if you vote for it against slavery, those slaves that are already there stay slaves. Any children they have will be born slaves, and so on and so on and so on. Basically, this is a lie. We're going to have slavery no matter what. And guess what? James Buchanan, again, he accepts the Lecompton Constitution. Way to go, James! Which just brought about the Civil War. The election of 1860. Southerners do not want to vote for Abraham Lincoln. The Democrats try to stop his election. Unfortunately, they completely fall apart. 3 different factions form, and it allowed Abraham Lincoln to win the Electoral College, but he is a minority president. Our first minority president. Did you hear that? I'll say it a third time. Our first minority president. Nearly 60% of Americans voted for somebody else. They didn't want Lincoln, but we got Lincoln, and we all thank goodness that we got Lincoln. Lincoln becomes a very strong president. Obviously, there's a lot about the Civil War. I'm not going to go into any great detail on that, but just know this, he crushes states' rights theories. He crushes compact theory. Lincoln increases the power of the president through the war, through war powers, suspends habeas corpus, basically just does whatever he can to win this war, and eventually the North wins the war, ends slavery. Lincoln, unfortunately, will be our first president to be assassinated. But this also, because he was such a powerful president, this eventually brought about Congress to grow and say, you know what? We don't want any more powerful presidents. Throughout Reconstruction, they began to realize this especially. Andrew Johnson, the vice president, now is president. He was never really a Republican at all. He actually was a Democrat and very much a racist. He tries to do everything he can to bring about some form of slavery back to the South. Congress, now controlled by radical Republicans, decide they can't take this anymore, and they impeach him. They impeach him for breaking the Office of Tenure Act, an unconstitutional law anyways, but they got him. They impeached him. He's the only president to not only be impeached, but then have a trial in the Senate. The only one to have a trial. One other president is impeached, by the way. Do you know who that is? Bill Clinton. Yes, that's true. Bill Clinton. I'm glad you came up with that. Very good. Ulysses S. Grant, general of the Civil War, he famously says, "Let us have peace," in his inaugural address. He is a two-term president, a Republican, a very nice guy, but not the smartest person around. During his presidency, multiple scandals. We also have the dreaded Panic of 1873, and the government decides, wow, there's this huge economic crash. I know what we'll do. Let's stop minting silver. No more silver. Let's contract the money flow. Let's take money out of circulation. Hey, how do the farmers like that? Not too well. They call that the crime of 73. One of the major scandals, we talk about all these scandals were happening during Grant's administration. The biggest one is Credit Mobilier, the fake construction company of the Pacific Union Railroad Company. Again, later on, we'll talk more about these scandals specifically. Rutherford B. Hayes, another Republican. Grant cannot run for a third term. Turns out Hayes, actually, funny thing about this, he doesn't win the election. He doesn't win the popular vote. He doesn't win the Electoral College. But his competitor, oh my goodness, I can't remember his name. He's a Democrat. I'm going to kill myself for that. But he basically doesn't win either, but no one wins a majority in the Electoral College. So it's got to go to the House. The House has to decide. We get the Compromise of 1877. We'll allow the Republicans to retain the presidency. Hayes becomes president, and the Democrats will get back home rule in the South. Reconstruction comes to an end. Sometimes we call this the corrupt bargain part 2. All right, now we're into the Gilded Age. All types of problems in the Gilded Age. It's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Party patronage is very, very important. James Garfield wins the presidency of 1880. Unfortunately for him, because he is going to reform party patronage, he is our second president to be assassinated. Charles Guiteau shoots him because he wants a job. This leads Chester Arthur, who becomes the vice president, now president of the United States, to help pass the Pendleton Act. This is what starts to bring party patronage under control. Instead of just getting a job because you help support a party, you now have to take civil service exams to get these jobs. The Republicans, by the way, are split into two groups at this time. Stalwart Republicans, which is what Chester Arthur was, and half-breed Republicans, which is what James Garfield was. May want to remember that too. It's very hard for Democrats to win elections because basically everyone blames them for the Civil War. Grover Cleveland, though, broke through in 1884. He wins the election. He's a Northern Democrat who never serves in the Civil War. He's our only 2 non-consecutive term president. He was able to win this election because he put the focus back on what we call classical liberalism, laissez-faire economics, small government. Major labor movements are happening at this time period. And in his second election, the 1892 election that he wins, we get another major panic of 1893. Seemed to have a lot of panics. I think people didn't really know what to do in this time period. Benjamin Harrison, by the way, is the president that's in between Grover Cleveland's 2 elections. I love this political cartoon over here. They always draw Benjamin Harrison very small, and as his presidency went on the 4 years, he got smaller, till he basically disappears. Poof. Because basically, who is Benjamin Harrison? I mean, really, Benjamin Harrison? It was like they one day sat there in Congress and said, I tell you what, that guy over there with the beard, let's make him president. Okay. His only claim to fame really is that his grandfather was president of the United States. Who was that? William Henry Harrison, our shortest term president ever. Wow, what a great distinction for Benjamin there. The Republican Party basically comes into major power in the election of 88. That's what helps Harrison win the election. They literally buy this election. They get repeaters and floaters throughout the North to vote often, vote early. It's cheating. I hope you understand that. That is actually cheating. We got our first $1 billion Congress. They got so much money they don't know what to do, so they made it rain on the veterans of the Civil War. Just doled out huge pensions to them. The Sherman Antitrust Act is passed. It was supposed to help labor, but actually it hurt labor. Instead of going after corporations, they went after labor unions when they went on strike. And again, like I said, this is the Industrial Revolution time period. Of course, the election of 1896 is going to start to close out this particular period here. This is a massive election that takes place. You have the Democrats and the Populist Party unite into the Demopops, a great boy band of the 1890s. They were awesome. They had all kinds of great hits. The girls loved them. Wait, no, I'm sorry. The Demopops was a pseudo type of political party. Sorry. I always get that confused. Anyways, they both nominate William Jennings Bryan in his Cross of Gold speech. You shall not crucify labor on this cross of gold. All right, whatever. The 16-to-1 ratio, William Jennings Bryan crisscrosses the country, giving speech after speech after speech, more than 300 speeches this man gives. William McKinley, the Republican, one speech. The front porch campaign. Gave it from the front porch of his house. Because Marcus Hanna, the Republican political boss, will basically outspend the Democratic Party here. For every dollar the Democrats spend on this election, the Republicans spend 16-to-1. You wanted a 16-to-1 ratio. That meant 16 ounces of silver for every 1 ounce of gold. That's what they're preaching. The Demopops, a bimetallism campaign. Well, the Republicans say, well, we'll do one better. We'll outspend you in this election, $16 to every $1 you spend, and we'll put out ads and campaigns, and we'll buy people's votes, and blah, 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 blah. And William McKinley wins this election anyways. And the gold standard becomes the standard of the Republican Party and the standard of America. America the gold, as it were. As we're coming to an end now here of the Gilded Age, there are some issues that are starting to emerge. Because of immigration, a lot of people coming to America that have no real experience in democracy. The growth of urban life, the massive cities are starting to emerge. Progressivism is starting to happen. Slowly but surely, progressive liberal ideas are starting to form. At the same time, imperialism. America goes to war with Spain, and we take Cuba and Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines. And all of a sudden, America has overseas colonies. China is a big issue for America because they want to trade. But China is being carved up by the European powers. So America asked for an open door policy, free trade with China. It doesn't work exactly how America wants, but America is starting to emerge now as a playa in the world. Did I say that right? Playa. They're a playa. Oh, that's terrible. I apologize profusely for that. Anyways, I hope that didn't take up as much time. So that's going to bring an end to this one. And look for tomorrow for part 3. Good night.